Religion and a deep personal desire to change helped former gangsters transform their lives. It's one of the findings of a new UCT study into how those trapped in violent gangsterism can turn their lives around. The study has tracked former gang members from the Cape Flats who have succeeded in leaving that life for good. Let's speak to the author of the doctoral thesis. It's Jane Kelly, who joins us from our Cape Town studios. Jane, good evening to you. Thank you very much for your time on South Africa tonight. It sounds like a fascinating doctoral thesis. Give me an idea, if you don't mind, Jane, where the idea came from to focus on something like this.
Absolutely, and good evening to you. Thank you for having me. So I've always been very interested in this idea of resilience. So people who can overcome very difficult or challenging circumstances and how they're able to do that. In South Africa, we know a little bit about how people join gangs, but we know very little about how they actually manage to exit gangs. And as we all know, gangsterism is a massive problem in South Africa, particularly in Cape Town. And so this was something that I wanted to explore a little bit more.
You may have heard it as part of my introduction to you, Jane, when I was saying that those who are trapped in violent gangsterism can turn their lives around. There are those who say it's a life choice, but that's not fair, is it? People are truly trapped in this lifestyle, aren't they?
Well, to an extent, but something that I found is that the men who had decided to leave was that they really developed this sense of agency where they said, I've had enough and this is something that I want to change. But what was really important is that that intention to change was coupled with the fact that they were able to draw on protective resources around them. So people that they could turn to talk to, religious institutions, those kind of things that really helped them to make a change in their lives.
What is the aim of the thesis? Obviously, you're doing a lot of research. Are there numbers supporting a better infrastructure, a better system for people who want to leave gangsterism, who are unable to find their help? Or is this merely a case of just identifying how difficult it actually is?
Well, no, the aim of my thesis was to explore how a group of 12 men made sense of their experiences of leaving the gang. So it was to demonstrate that this is actually, in fact, possible. It sort of goes against the stereotype that once you're in a gang that you're in there for life. And while it is difficult to do so, something that I found really profound in my research is that what supported them in being able to do that was that they became role models in their communities and role models to their families, and that is what supported them in their ability to leave.
When you're obviously doing your research and speaking to people that you've interviewed for your thesis, Jane, what seems to be that moment? What tends to happen to someone who's a gangster who decides, today, this ends, I'm going to change for the good? What happens, do you think?
Yes. Well, I think one of the things actually I found is that it's not always a moment. So it's actually a process where you have sort of these little experiences and these things that happen and they build up over time, and eventually you reach a point where enough is enough. But that being said, there were sort of critical, pivotal turning points that prompted the final decision to change. One of them, for some of the men that I interviewed, was becoming a father, and another one was sort of negative experiences related to being in the gang. So, for example, ending up in prison and realizing that none of their gang brothers actually came to visit them, so they don't feel supported anymore. So those kind of experiences did prompt the sort of the final decision to make a change.
Did the people that you spoke to, you mentioned that many of the men you've spoken to, I imagine the thesis focused majority on the males involved in gangsterism. Was it this social rehabilitation, the reintegration into society that perhaps played a part in trying to leave, and those who felt they wouldn't be accepted back into everyday society?
I think that what helped here was that the majority of them became sort of very active community members, and I think that helped for them to then be accepted by their community. So they do a lot of outreach work. They work with other young people who are trying to exit gangs, or other young people who are involved in drugs or might be at risk of becoming involved in those things. So I think that helped for sort of their communities to support them in that process.
And when it comes to the age of those that you had a chance to interview, obviously when it comes to a thesis, there's very strict guidelines as to who you can talk to and the ages and consent and all that. What was the youngest gang member that you had access to? Because gangsterism doesn't start at 18, it starts much younger than that, doesn't it?
Absolutely, it does. The youngest former gang member, so all of the men that I interviewed were former gang members. None of them were current gang members. The youngest former gang members was in his early 20s. But that being said, many of them, had joined their gangs, as young as 13, 14.
And when we now look ahead as to this is the thesis that you're putting through, obviously someone who's as involved and as intelligent as you are, their thesis is one thing. I imagine you're going to want to do some kind of work in this field when the doctorate comes through to you, and I can call you Dr. Jane Kelly on this topic. What is your aim with this for yourself once the thesis is accepted?
Well, actually my thesis has been accepted, so
congratulations.
I graduated last year, and you can officially call me Dr. Jane Kelly, but I do prefer Jane. At the moment I'm actually very excited. About a month ago I started working with the Department of Community Safety in the Western Cape government, so I'm really hoping that my experience with my PhD can help in my new role there.
Just before I say goodbye to you, now I'm going to call you Dr. Jane Kelly. I'm going to call you your proper title. Anyone watching this, Dr. Kelly, and they want to get involved, they've been inspired by what you're doing. The Cape Flats is a big area. It's a big talking point in that part of the country. How can someone get hold of you? How can they get involved? What can someone do if they're looking at you and I discussing this and going, I'm sure I can do something? What do they do?
I think that's a good question. There are lots of great organizations out there that really are trying to make a big difference. I think the one that comes to mind for me is called the First Community for Resources Center in Hanover Park. And anyone who wants to help and find out more, I would definitely suggest that they get in touch with them.
All right, Dr. Jane Kelly, I'm going to thank you for your time this evening. PhD psychology graduate, publishing that thesis on how people have successfully left the gang life. A huge pleasure having you here on South Africa Tonight.